So I went to school here, many moons back. Well, this building actually was erected. Sharing and Sarah. Right here was a building called Instant Lab. Some of you might remember that. Perhaps you can go to the old Google Maps and look it up. So I spent quite a bit of time in this building here. So a lot of not only fond memories, but also amazing professors who taught me a lot of things along the way. So hopefully you'll learn something new today. Do not let me just be a monologue. I want you to raise your hands, stop me, and ask questions. Walk away feeling like you've learned something today. I don't have your background, so there's a lot of stuff that I can cover. I'm going to try to take a few things that hopefully would pique your interest and get you to think more about outside of the box. Energy transition is a very complex transition. Expensive and complex, so there are many subtleties to it. And today, what I'm going to talk about is what software does to batteries specifically. We all know about software and other things, but specifically as it ties to batteries. It's an area that we have, as a company, Qnovo. Q, of course, is universal symbol of charge. Qnovo is that for new. So we've been doing this now for 15+ years. Software that's now in the field, and EVs and smartphones and others. So let me start with this, just to bring you down to earth. I don't think I can get the sound across, but you can get the point. Boom. That fire, by the time the firefighters showed up in the basement in Seoul, it took them about 8 hours to put it out. They had to evacuate 700 residents in that tower. For 2 days, 2 nights in the summer, they slept in tents on the sidewalks. So needless to say, a lot of people were really pissed off, including the government. So, what happened with the other youth? All gone. All gone. So, I start with that because today batteries are everywhere and increasingly becoming more ubiquitous. Like, you all have phones with you. When was the last time you stopped and thought about what's the value doing? You take it for granted. Cars, EVs, now being deployed across the world. That spans trucks, trains, storage. If you watch the news, Moss Landing was in the news just last week. 400 megawatt hours. We'll talk about the scale just a little bit. Massive. So we're putting batteries everywhere. And I shared also over lunch that when we started the company, we looked around and said, how many universities graduated people who understood batteries? I think at the time in 2010, there were 6 universities in the country that did. Today, many more. But that meant also that the skill sets were scarce. So 20 years ago, when you said, I'm going to go work on batteries, how many of you actually who were in scientific field said, oh yeah, I'm going to go work on batteries? Because that, what it evoked in your mind was the lead acid battery. So cheap stuff. It's like, what am I going to do with that? And so we now have batteries evolving rapidly, being deployed massively, economics come into play, and it's not a perfect storm because we need to decarbonize and energy transition happening at the same time. So we'll talk about some of that. What does it really mean in terms of deployment? What does it mean in terms of challenges, economic, policy, and of course, technical. Watt hours, everybody knows what watt hours is? Yes, no, maybe. Right. Energy unit. Okay, it's not SI, it's not joules, but it's a multiple of that. So let me put it in perspective for you. Your phone, 15 watt hours, roughly. You have a drill at home, electric cordless drill, it's about 100 watt hours. Scooter is about 1 kilowatt hours. Your home, average home, not apartments in the US, is about 30 kilowatt hours every day. So you start seeing now, logarithmically, we're going up. Your car, EV, Tesla is about 60 kilowatt hours. Have you seen the big truck from Tesla, the electric truck, it's a megawatt hour. It's a megawatt hour. That means I can power my home for 30 days. You know, scale. And then, of course, on the large end of it, is now you're seeing a storage facility like Moss Landing that's 400 megawatt hours. Nice scale. Let me put it in the more tangible terms. A banana has about as much energy as the electric battery does, about 100 watt hours. It's about 1 watt hour is just a bit more than a calorie, just about. So you can get a sense of what the energy is. Now let me bring it even more tangible to you. Every time you go on your Google and you make a search, that's 0.3 watt hours in a data center, just consume 0.3 watt hours. So 1,000 of those is about roughly 3 bananas, right? Now, next time you go on your computer and you go to ChatGPT or whatever your favorite AI engine is, that's now 3 watt hours. 3 watt hours per search per query. So if you had it hypothetically on your phone, 5 queries, battery in your phone is dead. 1,000 of those queries is about as much energy as your house consumes in one day. So you see the scale, you see the competing factors now. You need energy because we have AI and computation that's rising. But at the same time, we need to conserve energy, we need to be efficient energy. And these are all the high level, 100,000 foot picture, the competing forces. So it boils down to efficiency. And efficiency means different things to different people. But I'm going to give you one simple example. Take your phone. Take cameras on your phone. And take amazing pictures. And you wonder, wait a second. How could I physically do that? I mean, that lens is violating all sorts of optics metrics, aberrations, things that you couldn't do in a plastic lens. That 20 years ago, we had to go polish optics to amazing precisions. The Germans, the Japanese were good at that. They were $2,000 lenses. How in the world can we do that in a plastic lens? And the answer is very simple. What we've done is shifted the burden from manufacturing to computation. What we did over decades is figure out how can I say I can live with lesser manufacturing quality, open up the latitude on the manufacturing. I can live with aberrations in the lens, chromatic aberrations, spherical aberrations, all the things that make the picture lousy. But correct for that because computation is very, very cheap. The amount of power that you have in your phone is about 100,000 times more than all the combined processors that took Apollo 11 to the moon. Just imagine the computational power. And most of the time it sits idle. And that's what your camera does. It comes back and says, I want to take that computation power and turn it into something that allows me to reduce the cost. So keep that concept in mind. And that's essentially what we do. And many others do in energy transition, but we do it specifically around the battery. Questions? So when you talk about the economics and the macro forces, the number one thing you want to think about is the economics of it. Are the economics favorable for adoption? Am I really helping essentially reduce the economics such that adoption becomes widespread? The first cars 100 years ago were not combustion engines, or more than 100 years ago. They were actually electric cars. They were running off of lead-acid batteries, 1905. But combustion engine took over because it was a lot cheaper to build combustion engines than to build lead-acid batteries at the time. So now we need to reverse that equation. And that means the battery cost itself has to improve. Go back to 2019, this chart. If I go back to 2010, best chart was off the roof. It was $1,000 per kilowatt hour. That meant for a vehicle, 50 kilowatt hours roughly, means $50,000 for the batteries. Not economic. Today, we're below $100 per kilowatt hour. And projecting with all the scaling that we're doing globally, Asia, here, bring that number down to below $70 per spot prices, which is different than sort of average prices, in China right now are $50 per kilowatt hour. So you can see massive improvement in economics, and that drives deployment, drives penetration. So when you do that, then you start thinking about, so what happens now? What is the consequence of the economics of it? And it feeds on itself. It's sort of scale drives cost down, cost drives scale up, and that sort of becomes it's a positive feedback loop for those of you who are tech. So you look at the first consequence of that is essentially deployment of EVs. We live in the Bay Area, so do not look at the Bay Area as a vignette of where EVs are globally. When you go out and see Teslas everywhere, some of you probably come from different places. You travel outside of the Bay Area and it's a different story. There aren't that many EVs there. That is changing. So, and that's forecasted that over the next 5 years, we'll hit somewhere on the order of about 30 million cars annually. To be optimistic, even if that's 20 million cars every year, that's pretty impressive because on average, every year, 100 million cars are sold globally. Well, about 17 million of those in the United States, about the same in Europe and the rest of China, Asia, elsewhere. And so now you're talking about 20, please.
For the Trump administration sort of announcements about?
A great question. I was waiting for that. The Trump administration is going to put a dent in the United States, not globally. I don't believe it's going to be a huge dent. Ultimately, companies have to build cars. The EV is just taking place. That's sort of what is happening. China is already making cars that are very attractive. So it'll be a dent, maybe it'll slow down, but it's not going to be a permanent dent. So I don't think that we're going to have a huge, massive impact. So that number might be off by a couple of million cars, but it's not going to be off by 5x. So the plan all goes well, the economics are favorable, the policies are favorable, everything happens in place, and we don't have more crises. Is also playing over that. The idea is that we would have all EVs in place sometime around 2040, 2045. I don't really want to know exactly, but that's a transition. So now you're looking at the first EV that came to market, not the GM EV1. Some of you might not know what the GM EV1 is. It's the first attempt at the EV by GM back in the 80s. Lousy. Look it up on Google. You see how ugly it is, right? But the real honest first EV kind of where Tesla came in and showed that you can make a car profitably or quasi-profitably. That was about 15 years ago. We're looking at transition that's going to take long, 30 years, maybe more. That's a very long transition. So I've talked a lot about EVs, and you're saying, wait a second, what about the other stuff? What about storage? What about anything else that's using batteries? 85% of all batteries today, after next year, we go on EVs. And the way you measure that is essentially what is the global capacity of manufacturing that's currently in place, but also being put in the ground over the next 5 years. And that's about, by 2030, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 gigawatt hours. So when you hear a gigafactory, by the way, in the market, in the media, gigafactory is 50 gigawatt hours. 50 gigawatt hours is 1% of what we're going to manufacture by 2030. So 100 gigafactories globally. Almost there, not quite. We're about 70 such gigafactories, not globally. And one gigafactory, 50 gigawatt hours, is all smartphones and laptop batteries, everything that we've ever built in 1 year is one gigafactory. You can see the scale. All phone batteries, laptops, makes up just one gigafactory. And the rest is everything else, with EVs being the bulk. So it begins to really show you a few things. One, we need to nail electric cars. We need to make sure that we know how to do that profitably, repeatably, safely, economically, technically, et cetera, et cetera. Second, all other applications over time will ride over that curve. The economics of it will ride over that curve. And third, when it comes to energy, it also tells you that the vast majority of energy storage will be in your car or mobility in general. And that means when you start thinking about the vision 10, 20 years from now, how can we leverage all those batteries sitting in the garages, in our parking lots? How can we leverage that to really retrieve that energy you want to go? There's another storage area. So now you're looking at visionary things. To make it clear, we're not even close. We're not even close to that one. That gives you some sense of where that younger generation can think ahead. Batteries and energy transition. So if we start looking at where are we in terms of penetration, we're early in the game. EVs today is 7% penetration in the United States. China is way ahead, about 40%. Europe is about 12%. And back to your question, is that going to go to 10% this year, or 8% this year, or by the end of Trump administration, will it go to 15 or 12 or 17? No one really knows, but it's going to go up. It is going up. And that's going to be driven primarily, not so much by policies and credits, but fundamentally by one thing, and that is the ability of building vehicles that people want to buy and they can afford to buy. Today, when you want to buy an EV, you ask yourself the question, is it going to be $50,000, $100,000? Oh, I can't pay that. Well, number two, what about the range? What about the charging speed? What about the charging infrastructure? Are they all there for me? So I'm not going to worry about range anxiety. Range anxiety is a kind of all-encompassing term, captures a lot of things, fundamentally about range, charging network, charging speed. And lastly, if you happen to be one of those residents in the tower that I just talked about, is it going to catch fire? All those must be addressed, and they are being addressed. These are fundamental issues today, and naturally, these solutions also propagate to storage. For example, the big fire that happened last week, Moss Landing. So, there are a number of ways that you can address these issues. The old thought was like, hey, materials. We're going to make better batteries. We're going to build them better. We're going to put more money in CapEx and manufacturing sites. We're going to put X-rays machines to test everything that comes out of the factory. Well, yeah, okay, that's great. But that goes back to the example of the camera lens that I talked about. I want to make better pictures. Let me make a better lens. Let me make sure that my curvature on the lens is absolutely perfect. I have coating on the lens. Guess what happens? It just gets expensive. And that doesn't scale where we are because battery building is very, very slim margins. I think I showed you that chart here. Should have spent some time on it. You can see here the profit in the best case scenario, that green layer, that green bar in there, really tiny. If you're sort of on the economic side, you're lucky to get single-digit profit margins in the battery building space. So that means you don't have the latitude to go spend a lot of money on more manufacturing. There's no return. Your ROI, the return on investment, is very slim, if any. Sometimes it's negative. So you have to think of other ways to get that benefit. And that's where software comes into play. That's back to the example of the camera. Software plays a big role. So some of you are going to say, wait a second. Now I'm just really confused. Batteries, it's materials, it's ions. We'll talk about the chemistry if you need to. How does software connect with that? Where is your bits? In the bits and watts initiative, I guess you call it here, right? I understand the watts part. Where the hell are the bits? Okay. Bits becomes in the control systems around it. The bits essentially comes into two areas. The intelligence to understand how to charge the battery, how to understand its characteristics, and how to charge the battery, because I can control those currents and voltages, what have you, in a very precise manner. And that charging process actually has immense and profound impact on the battery's performance. How you charge the battery is absolutely profound. So, for example, I'll give you a tidbit. If you go buy an iPhone, whatever your favorite phone is, if you want your phone battery to last forever, ever charge it 100%. Stop at 90%. That battery will last you an eternity. So that last 10% makes the difference. Now, of course, you can't go and say, I'm going to charge my car to 90%. I'm going to forego that last 50 miles. Now you waste a lot of money. So the intelligence comes into, how do I manage those last 10% in a very clever way? And that's where the bits come into play. Same on the, what we're going to call the discharge. Discharge is now when I'm taking energy out of the battery. How do you do that? What shape, fashion I can do that? Another example to illustrate how the bits and watts connect together is 101 up the street. You want to get on 101 at 5 p.m. Has anyone done that recently? Have you been on 101 at 5 p.m. in the afternoon? Great. You go on, I don't know, say what, University Ave, you want to jump on 101. First thing you're going to see is traffic lights. You got traffic lights that are gaming and timing the traffic entry to the highway. Why? What are these traffic lights doing? Any idea? Come on. I don't have any gift for you today. I should have done that. But any idea? What are those traffic lights doing on those freeway entrances? How?
It's all cars to stop the whole traffic that's in pass.
You're right. So it's a closed loop system. It's measuring first the flow on the freeway, or sometimes the lack of flow. And what it's doing is optimizing the flow, the incoming flow, onto the incoming cars onto the highway. But guess what? It's exactly how the battery works. The battery, you have ions. Think of now cars, take cars out and put ions, lithium ions in place. And those lithium ions are traveling from one anode, from one electrode to the other. The charge is cathode to anode. If it's discharge, it's anode to cathode. When you're charging, now you're adding more ion to the flow. How you time that ion flow in there makes the world of a difference. If you take those traffic lights out on the freeway entrances, you risk, obviously, congestion. But what is the alternative risk to congestion? Is also accident. Cars will collide. And in some very simplistic way, ions collide too. No, they don't collide in the way they have an accident, but when ions collide, I'm going to put it in quote unquote, they actually they no longer contribute to the energy storage equation. So lithium ion plus lithium ion makes Li2, and that's in metal. It drops out of the chemistry and deposits inside the battery as a metal. And now you've just lost one of the tiny fraction, but you've lost a fraction of the elements that contribute to storage. So the way the battery works is a bunch of ions shuffling from one electrode to the next. Then they go sit in one area. When I'm discharging, they make the travel that to the other one. What happens? So when the ions drop out of the equation, you lost energy. And ultimately, you have enough of those, and you either get loss of storage entirely, and that's how the battery ages, or worst case scenario, the metal keeps depositing on top of each other, and ultimately you have a short circuit inside the battery, and that's exactly what happened in that video that you saw earlier. Just ignites. So by putting those traffic lights, the bits, you now are optimizing how those ions are playing with each other and going in there. Obviously, it's not that simple in the sense that 101, I have sensors in the ground, you can measure traffic, you can have cameras that look at the cars. What do you do inside the battery? And that's where the science really comes into play.
You try to share it.
Good drop. Oh, perfect. So a quick video just kind of shows you in reality what we do. It's not just simply software, it's actually a whole platform. Our software is deployed in cars. This is in Korea, actually, we're on cars in Korea. And what it does is a bunch of things. First and foremost is really ensuring the health and safety of the battery. It's actually safety first. So if there's ever a remote possibility that the battery may have a defect or could potentially catch fire, you want to highlight that, take the car out of circulation immediately. And that's looking for a needle in a haystack, literally a haystack. These statistics are typically on the order of 10 parts per million. Very, very small number. But you don't want any of those to catch fire. It's like airplanes. You don't want any plane to crash, full stop. Okay? Even though flying is very safe, you don't want anything to crash. Same with EV cars. Second is ensuring is the health of the battery. Health really actually means longevity. How do I guarantee that the life of the battery is going to be there for thousands of miles or millions of miles to come? The cynic might say, wait a second, I just bought a Tesla or whatever my car is. 100,000 miles is plenty for me. Well, yeah, it might be. But the residual value of your car now depends on how much energy is left in the battery after you finish driving. So when you choose to sell your car in 10 years, let's say, and you've exhausted 100,000 miles, you could have a zero residual value because your battery is depleted and dead. Or you could say, wait a second, my range is still great. Now I've got 50%, 60% of my residual value is still there. I can now sell the car at that. So that matters. The longevity of the battery matters. And it matters even more for commercial vehicles. If you have a truck, taxi. How many of you have taken a ride in a Waymo? Oh, I like that. Waymo, each car in Waymo drives about 400,000 miles. So you can't sort of say, 100,000 mile warranty is enough. That's not good enough. That's the economics fail. Because the cost of the battery is very high and the cost of the vehicle. So for them to make money and make sure that the AV autonomy works on a Waymo car, or anybody who wants to compete with Waymo, the battery cost has to be such that you have attractive economics. And you can either do it by reducing the cost of the battery. It's not easy anymore because we're going to reach in that plateau slowly. Or you extend the longevity of the battery by a lot, which we can do, and software plays a big role in that respect. Questions so far? Wow, I'm impressed.
Quick question. It seems like charging stations are not as common as gas station. So I think we need to increase the number of charge station first to popularize the EV cars.
It's a chicken and egg problem. Who comes first, chicken or the egg? The EV or the charging station? It's a very vicious question. Well, okay. So let me tell you why it's a very tricky question. If you were to start a company, and there are many companies out there that are building charging stations. ChargePoint, right? Some of you might know ChargePoint, but down the street. But close by. Go look at the financials. Wall Street doesn't like it. Why is that? Because when you're building the infrastructure, someone needs to fork out the money, build the infrastructure. And that means you're in the concept of build it and they'll come. But what if they build it and they don't come? Now you're sitting on a pile of cash in the ground, you're not making any decisions. It becomes a very tricky equation. So the right answer is you need both. You want the chicken and the egg. You want the EVs deployment to happen, and you want also the charging infrastructure to happen. Some folks sort of say, well, wait a second, the government would take care of that. That's really, really tough to argue. It's really tough to argue. So you want both. And that's always the timing to make sure that people want to buy EVs, and that drives them cycle for more charging stations, which then drives back to EVs, purchase cycle, and then begins to feed on itself. So give you an example on that. Ford T-Model came to market in 1922. Were there roads? Or many roads? So the argument was like, which comes first? The car or the road? How did we resolve that problem? Any idea? Did both. You both, but how did it work out? So GM and the car makers back then, because there wasn't just GM, Ford. I mean, GM was GM, and there's like about 100 car companies back. They all went and lobbied massively to build roads. But in fact, 1939 is when they were first successful in building the first freeway, highway, not road, highway in the country. And that's what is today the I-10, the I-110, Pasadena Freeway. If you're from LA, you know LA. From downtown LA to Pasadena, the I-110 is the first freeway. It was called back then the Pasadena something roadway, right? First freeway, and that was under massive lobbying by the car makers to establish roads, because without roads you wouldn't send cars, and then you were stuck in that vicious loop. So we're in that same situation today. Yeah.
So how much degradation, well, two questions. First, how much degradation people typically expect from a battery degradation from an EV at the end of its life? And then if EV batteries haven't really been in the market for its full lifespan yet, which is like what, 25 years, then how do they test that?
Great question. So typically, when it degrades to 80% of its original capacity, it's considered depleted. If, however, you buy an EV today, you buy a Tesla, you know, whatever, and you go look at the fine print in the warranty, not 80%, 70%. 70 to 80% is considered depleted. The fact of the matter, however, if I bought a car with a 300-mile range, now at the end of its life, 70%, I'm at 210 miles of range. I've lost, not 30%, I've lost 90 miles of range. That's a lot. So what you see now is really a push, massive push to make sure that when cars get to the warranty, end of warranty, they've lost no more than about roughly 10, 15%. So that's where software comes into play too. Second one is on what you essentially said, what's called shelf life. Shelf life is the battery now sits for just ages and ages and ages. So even if it's not being used, it actually doesn't have to, it can degrade. And that degradation mechanism is first and foremost driven by temperature. So what you see is containing temperature, make sure that temperature swings are limited. So for those long life storage, for example, you have HVAC systems, you have containment such that the temperature is contained within. The battery is super happy between 25 C, 35 C. If you can keep it in that 25 to 35, very happy. But in fact, the worst, so now I'm talking about smartphones, the worst situation for a smartphone is like what we call the Uber case. The Uber case, that you've got the phone sitting on the dashboard. It's plugged in. And in summertime, the sun is shining and the phone is cooking and being charged at the same time. That is the absolute worst case scenario. That is a sure guarantee to make sure your battery goes to degradation barrier. So these are all the intelligence becomes to understand the failure mechanisms of batteries and begin to mitigate those. So today, when I told you, don't charge your phone above 90%, what I've done indirectly is made you the intelligence. I've made you the bits right now. Telling you what you need to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Why didn't Apple just put the charging at 100% that we see at 90% in real life?
Because it means they have to make the battery bigger. Still give you your whatever 20 hours of the plane. They have to essentially add an extra 10% that's invisible to you. And that's cost in size. They don't have that luxury. Car makers do exactly that. Phone makers don't have that luxury because those phones are compact and tiny. They're putting more and more stuff. They're now putting neural engine network, what do you call it, neural networks in them. And so now essentially you're putting more energy demands on them, and you need that energy. You cannot just simply take it. So what I've essentially said to you is now you are the bits. You can control. You can now sort of say, wait a second, I don't need to be at 100% today. I'm not traveling. I don't need my full battery. Like, I'm in the office, I'm at school, I'm fine if I'm 80%. But tomorrow I'm gonna take a plane ride to New York City, and my gosh, I need my phone all day. So then you are the bits, you would charge 100%. So that's one example where now you don't need you to be the bits. Software can take over. One of many things, but software can take over one of those intelligence factors and be the bits in them. So, for example, here I show you a bunch of Japanese companies. So we actually run on all the phones in Japan. In Japan, back to the sustainability aspect of it, Japan was the first market that said, I don't want to see batteries in the landfill in working phones. I want to see 4 years of warranty on the battery, 4 years. So if you buy a phone in Japan today, you get 4 years of warranty. So back to your question on Apple. If you look up the Apple warranty on the battery, 1 year. Can we make it 4 years? Absolutely, absolutely. But that's back to sustainability. So how does it work? That's probably as deep as technical I'm going to get here, but if you want more technical detail, of course, jump in. So first and foremost, it's really understanding what the battery does and doesn't do. So understanding its chemical behavior, electrochemical behavior. So when a company manufactures a battery, I don't know how many of you know battery makers, but there's only about like 6 big ones in the world. Samsung, LG, SK, CATL, Panasonic, and the rest. They don't tell you how they built the battery. Because some of that, a lot of that is proprietary. In some ways, it's sort of like witch's brew. Sort of, even though the materials are the same, but I always joke thinking about, well, it's not quite that sort of, there's an electrochemist sitting in the back of the office and kind of like just stirring the electrolyte. Not quite, but actually, it is not semiconductor manufacturing. Years and years ago, I was in semiconductor business. There, when you make transistors, you can make trillions of transistors, and they're all identical. Identical. Batteries don't. They're close enough, they're not identical. Because the manufacturing process, nowhere near sophistication, and there's nothing like Moore's law. Moore's law in semiconductors is very fundamental to how performance and economics are tied together. That doesn't exist in batteries. And so companies are very protective over their secret sauce. The nature of the materials and how they build it together, the structure. So the first thing we do is we bring those batteries and we put them, we have a fairly sophisticated test facility. We test batteries. We test them to failure. We test them under all sorts of conditions. And from that, we derive very sophisticated models, electrochemical models of the battery. How does it work? What ions do? When I talk about the example of the traffic light, all those optimizations, we figure that out at that stage. And these are all captured then in software. So the software is the encapsulation of these models. In addition to that is, what do you do if I encounter a situation X, Y, and Z? What do we do? Now, if I encounter early signs of degradation, I don't have to wait to 80%. I'm now at 100%. And I've noticed that there's 0.01% degradation. What do I do? So all those are captured in there, the mitigation. Simple example is, you go to the doctors and the doctor said, oh, your cholesterol is too high. Right? What do you expect next from the doctor? You expect the doctor to tell you, well, you need to be on medication, you need to lose some weight, whatever, some mitigation that needs to happen. The doctor doesn't tell you that. You're not going back to that doctor. And that's exactly what we do here. That's what the software does. So it's doing the diagnostics and the prognosis, but also it's offering the mitigation. The mitigation is where the compute comes into play. These are fairly sophisticated control loops. Let's say I measured chemistry. Now I need to make some computation and determine what do I do next. Now, these are all captured essentially in what's called the ECU. The ECU is what's called the electronic control unit. It's a processor with memory that sits in the vehicle. And there are many ECUs in the vehicle. There's one for your infotainment, there's one for your lights, and there's one for the battery. And so that's where our software runs, and it does all the things that we just talked about. In addition to that, that data is reduced in form. So we process locally many terabytes of data over the life of the vehicle, many terabytes. So we're looking at voltages and currents on a scale of tens of milliseconds. So batteries, by the way, are not like electronics. So anything more than milliseconds, less than milliseconds is, chemistry has no idea what happened. It's just milliseconds and slower. But if you accumulate that over the life of the vehicle, it is a massive amount of data. So you can't use all of it and send it to the cloud. So that gets reduced down to kilobytes. And that sort of parameterized value, sort of what are the key things that I care about. And then it's sent to our cloud solutions where we now aggregate that data over large numbers of batteries. So that means, think of this being the doctor. The doctor says, I know what your health metrics are, your heart rate, your blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And this becomes where the machine learning comes into play, is like the public health version of that. Now we're looking at large scale. We're looking at fleets of taxis, of trucks, of cars, just like they're looking at large number of individuals and sort of say, what is my public health policy should look like? For example, do I see a systemic failure mode in the battery? Do I see, for example, that when everyone's driving in Alaska, that cold weather has some unique aspects that we did not understand before? So these are at large scale. And by the way, software in the car is not some kind of app you download from the store. These have to be, they have to operate within some very, very time constraints in terms of safety. You cannot have a blue screen of death come on your screen and say, oops, sorry, the car just stopped. Can't happen under any circumstance. So these are all subject to very strict standards, quality standards that automotive guys do. By the way, everything I've said on a car also applies for stationary storage. So to dig a little deeper, then you talk about the ECU. And the ECU often is called the battery management system. BMS is often you might see that on the video. And that information, the intelligence sits here. It's taking voltage and currents and okay. I don't know what happened here. Okay. Let's try to stop sharing and do it again. Sorry about that. Okay, trying to share. Oh, there you go. Software. See, you cannot have this in the car. Yeah. Okay. See?
Maybe you expanded the screen, so if you do like this, maybe you can get it to the size.
Let me get it and do it again. See, it's perfectly fine here. Still one more time. Okay, I don't know how to operate this schedule.
I think that if you do this.
You do this?
Yeah.
Ah,
There it is.
okay, perfect. Smart. Okay, awesome. Wow. Maybe more, huh? Okay. Okay, all right. So let me just come back. I won't touch the screen anymore. Let me come back and point to the very important fact today that's driving battery safety. And that's what's called dendrites, or you might say lithium plating or dendrites. And these are tiny, 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 tiny amounts of lithium plating. So lithium combining with another lithium and dropping as a metal and beginning to create short circuits. So if you remember, you might remember, for example, the Note 7 fires from Samsung many years back. So that's an example of lithium plating. Where it happened is the battery itself was perfectly fine. But when they put the battery inside the phone, there's a little cavity where the phone can hold. And there was a tiny, tiny, tiny manufacturing defect where that cavity was about 50 microns smaller than it needed to be. Battery was inserted there. The operator pushed it in, and that phone went to peace. And that caused enough of a mechanical stress on the corner that began to cause those lithium-ion combine together at that stress point. And over the course of months, there's short circuits and those batteries caught. So to catch these things in manufacturing is extremely difficult, extremely difficult. But that would be caught readily software.
Later as a feedback from the machines or before?
In the field, the moment you start, the moment we start putting lithium ions combining together inside the battery, we catch it.
The fires need to happen.
No. Long before the phenomenon. You want to avoid the fire. Once the fire happens, it's too late. This is actually so the phone ships and you begin to use it. And then our software says, wait a second, I got a problem. And we'll basically say, bring your phone back to the manufacturer.
So what is it sensing that gives you that feedback?
It's sensing the loss. So there are signatures. So there's something called electrochemical impedance spectroscopy. Mouthful for electrochemistry. But that's sort of like the scientific gold standard of electrochemistry. And there are signatures. And that when you begin to lose ions to lithium plating, it shows up in the signatures of that spectroscopy. You're looking actually at a frequency sweep and the impedance, the voltage and current impedance, is a function of frequency. And you get this signatures for that. You combine chemistry and then all of that implemented into the ECU with software overriding that.
These package scenarios are really long database.
So back to your question. So now let me switch to commercial vehicles. A Class 8 truck, 16-wheeler, big trucks. So we're slowly electrifying that. And people might say hydrogen electric, and that's a different argument for a different day. Let's stick for electric for the time being. So that battery is about roughly 500 kilowatt hours to a megawatt hours. One of those batteries would power your home for a week, for a month. Problem is that right now, an electric truck is about twice cost of a diesel truck. Diesel truck is about 125K. Electric truck is about $250. So it's just, you go to a trucker and go buy one of those and go like, okay. So you have to tell them that that truck has to last forever. And so today, for buses, by the way, is the same category. So when you see the buses that many places have bought, municipalities, some of those buses actually, they have to come in after about 200,000 miles or 150,000 miles and swap out the battery, replace the battery, actually died. What the software does is extends the longevity. So in this case, this is real data from real bus. Actually, this is a real bus case in Germany. where the battery dies after about 200,000 miles. And then essentially with the software, you can extend that to a large, easily 2x, 3x that. And so what happens is the economics of the truck now, or the commercial vehicle, are vastly changed. So becomes not quite competitive with a diesel truck, but it's getting much better, getting awfully close. You amortize all the additional costs. So the front costs of a diesel truck are much lower than that of an electric truck. By the time you factor maintenance, fuel and diesel and everything else, over the life of the vehicle, when you extend the life of the battery, then the electric truck becomes about as comfortable as it is. Crucial, when you bring technology, bits and software, in the watch, make the economics very good. So TCO is total cost of ownership. So for commercial vehicles, you don't look at what you pay up front, but really what is my total cost from the moment I acquire the vehicle to the moment I leave it or sell it.
So my question is, this software under a business model question, it's going to be sold to natural persons or to big companies?
B2B. B2B.
Yeah, because maybe there is a market of battery replacement for the big companies, and they are interested in make them not that reliable.
2 slides. I'm going to touch on that one. Very astute. So now let's talk about grids. And I think we had briefly conversation over lunch about V2G, V2X, whatever you want to call that, right? Eventually we will get there. But eventually is not tomorrow or next year. It's many years out because of a number of reasons. One, if you don't drive your car and you use it for V2G, you're still using the battery. You're still degrading the battery. As a matter of fact, the Nissan Leaf, old one, have V2G capabilities. You can buy a Nissan Leaf today. They're cheap, like $3,000. You can bring it home and stick it in your garage. You charge it at night, use it all day. Technically, it works. But the economics at large scale begins to fail because the degradation of the battery really becomes very important. And it's now been shown that actually when you use the battery repeatedly, stationary battery in your car, you will get the same degradation as you would as if you're driving. So that needs to be resolved. Software comes into play. Second, what is not been resolved is the economics of V2G or V2, especially V2G. The V2G basically says, I'm going to sell my power or my energy, really, not power, to the grid. Okay, great. Who's pricing it? What am I going to get for it? At what time of the day? Who's the arbitrator? Is it PG&E really? Because PG&E right now is not really giving you a fair price on the solar power. So solar, for example, is dictated by policy. There is no policy that says what you get priced for the energy exchange when you sell energy from the car back to the grid. But these are all wild questions at this point. There's no answer for that. Europe is actually working on that one. We're not. Back to the Trump question. This is way on the back burner. Even though states have authorities and judicial authority over these questions, there's not much going on there.
Is the net energy metering policy exclusively for solar? Wouldn't it be applied as well for cars?
It can, but it doesn't right now. EVs are not mentioned in there. Somehow you're going to have to make your EV look like a solar panel. And the reason why I say that is not just simply technical. For the utilities, solar is when the sun shines. Whatever, 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, whatever, some number of hours. But you put a battery in the EV in there, that changes everything. Now it's like, I've shifted everything. I don't have to sell you energy back when the sun is shining. And so for the utilities, They know exactly the demand today. They have very good predictive curves on demand. And they know when to fire the gas turbines in the evening to make up for the demand when the sun begins to set. Let me leave you with one last important, and that's the end of this. Building a battery right out of the gate, 7 tons of CO2. Out of the gate. Why? Because you have to mine the battery, you have to refine the material, you have to manufacture it. I told you earlier we need 5,000 gigawatt hours or 4,000 gigawatt hours by 2030. Any idea how many new mines we need to put in the ground? Just a random guess. How many what? New mines. Mine. Need to mine for cobalt, iron, nickel. People think it's lithium. Actually, lithium is the smallest piece. We need to put 300 new mines in. And half of those are copper and aluminum. Because once you have electricity, I need to move it from one point to another. And that needs copper. So we have a lot of mining. And it takes 7 tons of CO2 to build one battery. To build the car, is another 20. So by the time you build a Tesla-like vehicle, you're now close to 30 tons of CO2. So that car catches fire. If that car does not meet its longevity or warranty, now that's a deficit of tonnage of CO2 that you've not kind of. You do the math on, for example, what happened 2 years ago when the GM Bolt, the recall, the Hyundai Kona did the recall, and every day for recalls. In China, by the way, China has every day on the ground in China, 8 EV car fires on the road every day on average. So you begin to do math and you go like, whoa, wait a second. I thought we're talking decarbonization here, right? So that needs to be fixed quickly. People think that when you buy an EV, the only footprint in the CO2 is how you garner or how do you source the energy to the EV. Solar, wind is renewable, so it's good. Coal, we're good. Yeah, that's fine. But remember that there's an upfront cost to just simply build a battery. And then the last slide is, we're just at the beginning. So when it comes to policy making, massively fragmented. So within the country, for example, NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, is the lead agency when it comes to federal regulations on car safety. Car safety, not what happened in Moss Landing. Okay. The EPA has another rule on the emissions. Now, expect that those two will be blunted in the next, actually, now, the next few years. And as you will see what transpires in the next 6 months, California does have a special waiver from the EPA way back in 1974 that allowed California to set its own emission standards. So far, it's been holding. Now it's going to be tested in courts. And if it holds, then I think the EPA effectively would be relegated to California standards. If not, then it's going to be the other way around. So very, very big decision coming up in the next year. CARB, another very powerful body. California Air Resource Board. When I lived in LA in the 80s, what's got that? I would come up from my dorm room and I could not see the San Gabriel Mountains behind me. This is what CARB did in the last 30 years, 40 years. Today, you look out from campus, you can see the San Gabriel Mountains. This is how bad the air was. It's another authority. They don't coordinate right now because this and this are on 2 different wavelengths. Then you start looking at local authorities. What happens in Moss Landing is now they're just jurisdiction of the local county fire authorities. So suppose you're in New York City, 60 stories, 70 stories, 80 stories. And you got a data center with batteries sitting up on the 8th floor. And then fire breaks out. What happens? Globally, United Nations has some significant efforts called the GTR 20, but that really brings a lot of nations in there. And as you can imagine, when you put everybody in the United Nations, we're not going to converge anytime soon. The Chinese have been by far most aggressive on standards, but unfortunately, they're not putting the right standards. So NHTSA, for example, is very clear. There shall be zero fires, zero events, called zero events, no fires. So put all the technologies in place, software, everything else to ensure there are no fires. China, these standards that are listed here, were put in place in 2020. And essentially what it says, if there's a fire in the vehicle, you shall give passenger and the driver 5 minutes to evacuate. So you can see polar opposite of the standards. That needs to be reconciled. I think I'm running out of time. So with that, I'll stop right here and take questions.